Hi, I'm Len Rydell, the Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I'd like to welcome you to another presentation in our symposium and tour of from Petersburg to Appomattox, which we conducted in Petersburg, Virginia in September of 1996. Our next speaker, I was told early on that there were only two living people that were absolutely consulted by God whenever God wanted to know anything at all about the Civil War and military history. One was Ed Bars, and the other was Dick Sommers. Dick was the military dean at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle Barracks for a lot of years. He oversaw the archives and was deeply involved in helping to lecture the senior military students, all lieutenant colonels and colonels that went to the U.S. Army War College. He knew the archives backwards and forwards. It had a huge photographic collection and innumerable numbers of primary source documents, and he well conditioned all of his staff to be able to tab and access all of these. So if you were a researcher and you needed something from Carlisle Barracks, you had no better friend than Dick Sommers. But Dick also was a extraordinarily disciplined researcher and so forth. And while he didn't have time to write a lot of books, he really, in fact, has only written two, one of which I'm going to talk about now as an introduction to the talk that he's going to give. And then the other, which was a leadership series, which sadly did not see the second volume because he passed away unexpectedly last year. So Dick's first book, and that book, incidentally, by Richard Sommers, was published by Savas Beatty Books, and I do commend it to you. It's a very intriguing read, and it is brain salad. So if you like to be challenged by an intellect who's a historical intellect, it is not a Velcro book, but he is very, very good and very analytical in doing it. So I recommend you look at Savas Beatty Press and consider grabbing that book. And I think it is on sale, this being December of 2020 when I'm doing this lecture at the time, I think, because he's passed and the book is probably not going to have a long print life. I think Ted may be selling out what he has there. So you may very well want to consider grabbing one of those books and tell Ted that I sent you. So that book on leadership is available. But the one I want to address, which Ted also reprinted, is called Richmond Redeemed. This was the subject of Dick's doctoral dissertation, and it is discusses the Fifth Offensive. Because of the length of the Petersburg campaign, there are up to, I believe there are 9 offensives that take place. These are various and sundry operations that grant orders to take place for various purposes. Some are distracting to help Grant achieve some other larger objective, but each is hoped and decided, if conducted properly, that perhaps it will break Lee's defensive works and lead to the destruction of Lee's army and the end of the war. And with the presidential election coming up in November of 1864, this being June, Grant is aware that he needs to try to make some things happen. And so the Fifth Offensive, which takes place in the fall of 1864, is the subject of Richmond Redeemed, and it takes a hard look at operations that take place primarily north of the James River, and it is a critical component of this because Lee is really straddled. He's got a hard problem because the Appomattox and James Rivers are significant obstacles to cross and support. And while now Lee is on his inner lines of communication, the fact is that Grant had already stolen a march on Lee and had crossed the whole Army of the Potomac without Lee knowing in early June of 64. And Grant masters the James River. Lee is not in a position to really contest him. And not only does Grant have the river, he's got Bermuda 100, which is right across the water where the Appomattox and the James come together, where Benjamin Butler has troops that have been bottled up, but they are north of Grant's deployed army that is stretching out. So when Grant considers putting troops north of the James, then puts them on the Bermuda 100 Peninsula, and then has the Army of the Potomac south of the Appomattox River, stretching out to the south and to the west, Lee is being stretched like a rubber band that will have to break somewhere. And so Dick, realizing that most of the attention had been focused on Operation South with Grant, determined to tell that story of continued operations north of the James River. And so that's what Richmond Redeemed is all about. So sit back. We're now going to talk about an area in which Grant goes for the jugular, Lee's jugular, by trying to get between Lee and Richmond, and that's the operations north of the James. So sit back, relax, and enjoy Dick Sommers' presentation on Grant Goes for the Jugular, the Fifth Offensive, Richmond Redeemed.
Interesting in finding the people who have devoted a considerable amount of their professional lives, or at least a good portion of their professional lives, to focusing on a specific topic, because we believe that those are the people who are best qualified to do that. To that end, we have asked people that one would think that we may not be able to get with an organization such as this, and in just about every single instance we have been very pleasantly surprised with the response that we've received because of the type of operation that we're putting on here. Our next speaker is really one of the giants in the Civil War and in the American military history arena in this country. I was once told, with respect to all the people who are members and in support of our organization, that the two living encyclopedias in the United States were Ed Bars and Dick Sommers. And if you spoke to either one of them or had questions along either line, you would quickly find that to be a true statement. Dr. Sommers is a graduate of Rice University. He is the chief historian of the United States Military History Institute in Carlisle Barracks. He is the splendid author of a number of very informative and interesting articles and reviews, but most noteworthy perhaps is his award-winning book, Richmond Redeemed, which deals with Grant's Fifth Offensive in the late September, early October period of 1864. That book won the Bell Wiley Award for the best book on Civil War and military history, wasn't it, for that particular period of 81-82. It was the first award along those lines. And Dr. Sommers was mentored by the great Frank Vanderburg, who many of you have heard of, and in fact has been a longtime friend and scholar of just about anybody who has done serious research on the American Civil War. His interests are as varied as major battles down to the smallest details in Arizona and in California, and not just in the American Civil War, but in all elements of military history and in American military history. If you would question, I think Dr. Sommers is certainly the person who's able to answer that for you. Today, he's just going to focus on a small, specific portion of Richmond Redeemed. He's going to talk about the Battle of Poplar Springs Church. I wish you would join me in giving a very warm welcome to a fine scholar and a fine man, Dr. Richard Sommers.
Thank you, Len. It's a pleasure to be here today to share with you some thoughts on a certain aspect of the siege of Petersburg. Now, we talk about Petersburg as a siege. We mean it not in the classic European sense of a siege, in which an enemy position is closely invested and the attacking army, the besieging army, attempts either to storm or undermine or batter down or blow up the defending ramparts. Rather was Petersburg a strategic siege in which General Grant fixed the Confederates in place around Petersburg and confronted them with the compelling strategic necessity of defending their railroads, their lines of communication running into Richmond itself. And from his great entrenched camp east of the city, Grant would send out a series of expeditions into the open country south of Petersburg or back onto the peninsula north of James River. And these expeditions would force Lee to send troops outside the works to try to intercept the expeditionary forces before they could cut the supply lines. This resulted in a series of pitched battles in the open field. Thus, the siege of Petersburg was not so much an effort to batter down the ramparts of the city as it was a series of continuing field battles over the course of 9.5 months, in which General Grant would attempt to get around the Confederate flank, either around the Confederate left flank and capture Richmond itself, or around the Confederate right flank and cut the railroads running into the city from the south. And General Lee would attempt to defeat these Yankee efforts and preserve his position. And since this is the month of September, I thought we could concentrate on one of these field battles to give a sense of what the overall course of the campaign was like. It is a battle not as exotic as the Crater, not as unusual as Fort Stedman, not as compelling as those first 4 days of June 15th to 18th, or as the culminating battles on April 1st and 2nd, which we'll be visiting on our field trips tomorrow. But it is a battle that is much more characteristic of the course of the siege. And if we could move on to the maps now, I'll outline what we're talking about. Don't strain your eyes to try to read the fine print. I'll be pointing out what it's significant to see. Bear in mind that red signifies Confederate fortifications and blue marks the Yankee works. Now, up here is Richmond. Down here is Petersburg. And this shows the situation in late September, where Grant, with his entrenched camp east of town, extended out, and since mid-August he has cut the Weldon Railroad at Globe Tavern. And now Grant is preparing for his next big push, continue west to cut the last Confederate railroad, the South Side Railroad, and also to cut the wagon roads that are running through Dinwiddie County, because the Confederates could still use the Weldon Railroad as far north as Stony Creek Depot, a few miles south of Globe Tavern, and then transship supplies by wagon through these back roads. So the operations that we'll be looking at now will be focusing on this area south and southwest of Petersburg. And Grant was originally planning to move into this area in early October, but his general-in-chief and his theater strategist for the whole Eastern Theater he had the responsibility not only for managing the operations directly against General Lee in the Tidewater, but being aware of what was going on throughout the East. And Sheridan's victories in the Shenandoah Valley at Opequon Creek on September 19th and Fisher's Hill on September 22nd caused Grant to move up his timetable from early October to late September in order to try to pin down General Lee, prevent Lee from detaching troops to Early out in the valley, or else to take advantage of the weakening of Lee if any butternut troops should have left to try to retrieve fortune out in the Blue Ridge country. Grant began his operations on September 29th with Ben Butler launching an attack north of James River, an attack that stormed Fort Harrison, which is located right up here, and threw the Confederate capital into the greatest clear and present danger that it ever experienced of being captured by a field army, 25,000 strong, not a handful of cavalry raiders or a boarding party from a Union warship, but a whole field army that could actually have held the city. Butler didn't quite get that far, and General Lee was able to bring up troops and counter him. But it disrupted the whole strategic situation in the Tidewater and created opportunities around Petersburg as well, because Grant conducted a series of two-pronged attacks, first north of James River and then a day or so later on the south side. So while Butler was fighting around Fort Harrison on September 29th, General Meade was standing ready to unleash the Army of the Potomac. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. And move on to the next one too, please. Okay, now here we see the situation around Petersburg and Dinwiddie County. Here is Petersburg, the Union fortifications here, two very thin outer Confederate lines running along the Squirrel Level Road and the Boynton Plank Road. And on September 29th, the day of Butler's breakthrough, General Lee transfers 11,000 of the 37,000 Confederate defenders from Petersburg to Richmond. He orders another 5,000 troops to be on standby to follow. He moves his own headquarters from just north of the Appomattox to the peninsula and entrusts to A.P. Hill the security of Petersburg and the Confederate fortifications. And Lee is prepared to abandon Petersburg itself, if necessary, to save his capital. And he begins making some preliminary dispositions to send the hospitals into Farmville and Danville and safely into the interior, if it becomes necessary. But Lee is not Joe Johnston. Just because there might be a danger, that doesn't mean that the danger will become real. Lee does not surrender to the possible danger. Lee fights back against the potential threat. And Lee attempts to hold his position at Petersburg while striving to secure his capital and the rapidly deteriorating situation on the peninsula. And we'll be looking now at the masterful Confederate defense that A.P. Hill executes to carry out Lee's basic strategy to try to save Petersburg, if at all possible. Well, the Confederates go marching to and fro, very conspicuously for the Union lookouts to see, stirring up these dust clouds that Jamie mentioned, creating the impression that they are remaining in force around Petersburg. When Meade sends out Gregg's cavalry division to probe this open country in Southside Virginia, Wade Hampton counterattacks Gregg and chases him back after some hard fighting. All the signs indicate that the Confederates continue to hold Petersburg in force. All the signs that are coming into Union observers, Union intelligence officers. Meade sees no indication of a weakening of the Confederate position sufficient to justify an attack. And of course, the Yankees have long since learned that you don't launch headlong frontal attacks against the Confederate works. And most of all, General Grant has learned that. And I would particularly leave with you the thought that Grant the Butcher, Grant of Cold Harbor, is a mythological creature that has no existence in the reality of the Civil War.